Advanced TV Herstory, the podcast that brings you fresh perspective on the importance of TV in our lives. We tell stories of leadership, persistence, and achievement of TV women because in the lives of women, no other media platform has influenced or inspired so many. Lo, these 60 years. Women of all ages have been impacted by what they've seen and will see on TV. So join us for a little advanced TV herstory by streaming it directly on our website, tvherstory.com, or anywhere you find podcasts. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. Regardless of when you're listening to this, we got to admit we're living in an age of reboots, as though no producers are willing to take a risk on new concepts and scripts on either the silver or the small screens. And it leaves us feeling like we're stuck with leftovers, maybe. Movies are now prequels and sequels and extensions, as though it's anything to milk more money from the same lucrative franchise. If it sold once, it'll sell again. And on TV, we've been told to expect a Roseanne reboot, Magnum P.I., Cagney and Lacey, and Murphy Brown, to name a few. But, folks, it didn't used to be that way. Originality, risk, art, they were part of the adrenaline rush of what it meant to work in the entertainment industry, what it meant to be creative. No one will ever say that someone associated with any of these reboots is a genius or somehow changed the TV landscape forever. Though when you think about it, reboots are themselves a big risk. Imagine the pressure of creating a show so that, in a sense, lightning, otherwise known in this case as the love and attention of the viewing public, might strike twice. That's pressure. And to the point of originality, here's the reality, people. We live in a world where every street or mall that still has retail stores has the same ones, whether that's a Banana Republic or a Panera Bread or a Sephora. Whether you're in Pittsburgh or Paris, you'll see them. But at least when it comes to art, or when it should come to art, every generation needs its time to shine, to apply its brilliance, to deliver its insight, to create the new characters that entertain and challenge us. So call me jaded, but I imagine that there are some younger listeners right now who might just say, isn't it enough that we have to listen to baby boom music and clean up their political and economic messes? Listener, I agree with you 100%. And as you can tell, I am not a big fan of reboots. But one is now in its second season and is worth discussing from a TV woman's feminist context. One Day at a Time, now showing on Netflix, is, as its billed, a refashion of a Norman Lear classic from 1975 to 1984. That's when it ran. Like all Norman Lear shows of the 70s, One Day at a Time used its platform in the American living room to tee up the socially relevant conversations that no one else was having. And it was a show that centered around a middle-aged, divorced woman raising two daughters. And so what is commonplace today was really, truly breakthrough in 1975. Lear, who was fresh from launching a string of other quality shows like All in the Family, The Jeffersons, Good Times, and Maude, he showed America that in no uncertain terms, a divorced woman could put her life back together, that teens weren't shattered by her actions, and that the family unit is in fact a pretty durable bond. And then it tackled a whole host of social issues. In 2014, at the age of 92, Lear published his memoirs, entitled Even This I Get to Experience, and I recommend it as the first-hand account. It's detailed and well-researched. It's of his mindset that became his imprint on American TV, culture, and the latter part of the 20th century. Norman Lear's Even This I Get to Experience. So this book tells an awful lot about how he came up with some of his philosophy. But this episode of Advanced TV Herstory isn't about Norman Lear. I'd like it to be, but his is not a story of feminist leadership. It sort of is, I guess. And this episode isn't even really about reboots. It's more about another living American national treasure, Rita Moreno. And we'll get to her in a bit. From hair to fashion to what was acceptable and risque when it came to teens pushing boundaries, the original One Day at a Time is a time capsule of the late 70s. If you find it on the extended channels on cable, I really recommend you at least watch an episode or two. Because the 60s or the early 70s shows that featured families with teens, like the Patty Duke Show, which was in early 60s, Leave It to Beaver, and The Brady Bunch, yep. None of them tackled issues like contraception, shoplifting, drinking, sex, feminism, and the challenges of everyday life, like One Day at a Time did. And yes, there were jokes, and there were some really kind of light plot lines, but there were also scenes that ended in dead silence, like pin drop silence. The original One Day at a Time was anchored by Bonnie Franklin, who was really only 31 years old when the show premiered, but had a long list of TV, stage, and film roles to her credit. When you look at the Norman Lear series of the 70s, All in the Family, Maude, The Jeffersons, Good Times, each was anchored by talent, people who knew how to transition quickly from comedy to a poignant line as the camera closed in. And in the fast-paced world of TV production, at least in the 70s, that talent usually came from stage experience. One Day at a Time attracted, in the 70s, an audience of women who were fascinated to see how this single mother did it, and how these two teenagers, because either you were a good girl or a bad girl, how these teenagers lived. Who knows how many conversations at American dinner tables were launched from last night's episode of One Day at a Time. Its ratings were solid and also attracted a male audience, in part because Valerie Bertinelli was the good daughter, and she was very attractive, and Mackenzie Phillips was the rebel, and both were huge in the teen magazines for years. Since the series' popularity, however, was greatest before cable took hold, its impact on the baby boom cannot be underestimated. There just weren't that many sitcoms where 3 women characters were the focal point for 22 minutes once a week. And there wasn't much else to do, and there were only 3 other channels to surf to. So the series took home Golden Globes, and the performers brought home Emmys, and it was in steady syndication for years. Franklin's later career, she never got a role that was as weighty as Anne Romano, and she passed away from cancer a few years ago. And then there's Mackenzie Phillips. And it's important for us to understand these 3 women and why it is then that One Day at a Time is even worthy of being refashioned here in 2017, 2018. Because Mackenzie Phillips, even in the midst of her fame as older daughter Julie Cooper, Mackenzie's career careened off the tracks. It was tabloid fodder, her cocaine possession, and a series of incidents on the One Day at a Time set that caused her to be fired from the show. That's a big step when you only have 3 main characters to work with. Phillips is the daughter of famous musicians John and Michelle Phillips. And Mackenzie has since told the stories of her childhood, raw stories of her drug use and the entertainment business in a memoir called High on Arrival. And she has also gone on to write another book called Hopeful Healing, Essays on Managing Recovery and Surviving Addiction. When you think about how many from her generation, she's about 60 now, have died of overdoses, and whether those are accidental or intentional overdoses, who have danced right up to the line but been saved, you have to believe that her insight into this topic is genuine and in fact came at an unfathomable expense. I encourage you to read either one of those books. In particular, High on Arrival, her memoir, goes into some she had a hard life. She strikes me, Mackenzie Phillips, as the first to say that she is no angel, and with so much storytelling, so much to tell about being a young woman in TV, I might just have to invite her to join us to share her stories of persistence and insight into leadership in an interview here on Advanced TV Herstory. What do you think, listeners? So that gets us to younger daughter Barbara Cooper, who was played by Valerie Bertinelli, one of the hardest working women in show business today. I follow Valerie Bertinelli on Instagram. Find her at Wolfie's Mom, and on Twitter as well. That's her handle, Wolfie's Mom. Bertinelli appeared in all 209 episodes of the series, even one more than Bonnie Franklin did. And she went on to also be in the series Touched by an Angel. She did a raft of made-for-TV movies and TV guest appearances throughout the 90s and early 2000s. She pretty much kept working the whole time. And she returned to TV, however, in 2010, joining the incomparable Betty White, Jane Leaves, and Wendy Malick in TV Land's Hot in Cleveland. My gosh, laughs. Just too many laughs there. See her these days in her own show called Valerie's Home Cooking. Now, she got into this whole cooking thing because Bertinelli is another one, like Mackenzie Phillips, who, having lived her life in the public eye, has pretty much had to share her ups and downs in that same transparency. At various points, she gained weight and she lost it and was put through the celebrity appearance ringer every time she was putting weight on. In 2008, she ultimately wrote the book called Losing It and Gaining My Life Back 1 Pound at a Time. And she followed that up the next year with another called Finding It and Satisfying My Hunger for Life Without Opening the Fridge. So it's a little self-help, it's a little life balance, and it's a little nutrition. Finally, Valerie has written 2 cookbooks. If you're into healthy eating, or at least really cool eating, One Dish at a Time, delicious recipes and stories from my Italian-American childhood and beyond. And last year, she wrote Valerie's Home Cooking. Valerie Bertinelli, it feels like, will always be a part of our lives. And that's a good thing. Because the original One Day at a Time not only empowered and challenged women and men by the plots, by the story arcs, by the lessons that they were telling, that Norman Lear wanted them to tell, but it gave these 2 women, Mackenzie Phillips and Valerie Bertinelli, the credibility to tell their stories when the time became right. They found their voice. So in this age of reboots, in this larger question, will we come to expect more from these shows that are taking advantage of the fact that there's already a template? There's some structure, there are bones. Are we going to expect more from these shows because the reboot runners have been given a head start? And what is it about the individual shows? Who decided Magnum PI? I guess I have to ask. But, there had to have been something about the original shows that made them classics. And is that element going to get picked up and really leveraged? Was it the premise, like the watershed divorcee Anne Romano? And yes, the word divorcee, which I don't think anybody these days uses, was used about 100 times in the first season of One Day at a Time. And it was used disparagingly because it was the 70s. And people brandished words and names and titles like swords back then. The word divorcee just dripped with a certain amount of judgment. So back to the reboots. Was it the chemistry? Like the cool chemistry that the cast of Roseanne had, which was always a little edgy, always a little tense, but they all are supposedly coming back for the reboot? Or was it the distinctive talent of Candice Bergen as Murphy Brown? One woman, one character, carrying a show. How is that going to work? But Norman Lear's refashion of One Day at a Time is in fact a tribute to the original premise. They got it right the first time, and listeners, I think they got it right the second. In this case, it's a household led by a divorcee, Penelope, with 2 kids, and yep, they live in the old Romano apartment. And lo and behold, there's a quirky building superintendent named Schneider who adds to the home or the family-based storylines, much like his predecessor. Lear's team, however, took a bold move to make Penelope Alvarez relevant, probably as comparably relevant today as Anne Romano for all of her pioneering in the workplace and her social life was back then. Because Penelope Alvarez is a veteran who served in Iraq as a nurse. And so episodes revolve around her work life as well as the home and personal situation that we see, this home life of a Cuban-American family, which is made immensely richer and realistic with the addition of Rita Moreno as Penelope's mother, Lydia Riera. Now, Penelope is played by American-born Justina Machado, who you may recall from 6 Feet Under, ER, Jane the Virgin, or 2 episodes of Devious Maids. As Netflix sends this show into a successful 2nd season and likely 3rd season, everybody loves it, expect to see Machado recognized with big awards like the Golden Globes and the Emmys, as well as the raft of important honors that do appear in IMDb that are awards given out across communities and organizations. And they are bestowed upon shows like One Day at a Time, those that go out of their way to foster representation and deliver excellent, relevant content. So I think Machado's career is on a meteoric rise. And also we have to look at young actors Isabella Gomez and Marcel Ruiz, who are Elena and Alex Alvarez. And they came to the show with short lists of screen credentials, but an incredible amount of talent. And yes, they have the honor of working alongside the incredibly accomplished Rita Moreno, who probably is old enough to be their great-grandmother, not just their grandmother, when you start to add up who's how old. But here it is. This is this truly Latino cast. And what a cool experience it must be for these young people to be with her at this time in her life, at this time in her career. Because Moreno is an under-celebrated national treasure. So do you remember, I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. Do you remember on 30 Rock when Tracy Jordan launched his personal campaign to attain the EGOT, E-G-O-T? It's the only reference I have ever heard in fictional TV to the recognition that one person can achieve in the 4 major areas of the entertainment industry. The EGOT, the E-G-O-T, is to win the Emmy, the Grammy, the Oscar, and the Tony. Since the creation of all 4 of these recognitions, only a dozen people can claim the EGOT, and I don't believe Tracy Jordan was one of them, even on a fictitious level. 5 others can claim it with an asterisk, but that's only because their work was recognized by one of the organizations, celebrated in a sense with an honorary or a special award. You know those special awards. You've watched the ceremonies. So let's look at the real EGOT winners. There are really only 4 women. And also it's important to understand, particularly if you look at the men's list, that EGOT winners are not necessarily performers, because within the Emmys and the Oscars, well, and the Tonys, musical scores are a prolific and competitive category. And so you have performers, and then you have musicians and composers and just some incredibly talented people on the music side. So it's not just for pure performance. But the women who have joined Rita Moreno on this established list are these 3 women: the early stage and screen great Helen Hayes, Audrey Hepburn, and Whoopi Goldberg. If you're curious, Google the EGOT, Google these women. It's really pretty fascinating how it is that they accomplished the recognitions that they achieved. Now, this is not just a distraction, you guys. The EGOT is really, she's Puerto Rican born, okay? She has lived her entire career in an industry that has been rife with sexism and racism. And so Rita Moreno is a role model in so many different ways. The fact that she's standing tall today and working at the age of 86, Jane Fonda's pushing 80. Rita Moreno is 86. Even Betty White had to retire at, 94. It's fascinating, and we are so fortunate to have them in the positions on TV. She was born in Puerto Rico, but she had become a New Yorker since her childhood, and her career really truly began in her teens. She was dancing, she was attempting to sing, and lo and behold, she admitted in her memoir, a memoir that I highly recommend, it's called Rita Moreno, a Memoir, you can't miss that she succumbed to and battled typecasting that comes through racism. So we'll talk about that in a second. Her memoir is filled with allusions to film roles that she gladly accepted over the years. Some B movies, to be honest, like movies you've never heard of. But they were roles that paid decent money, and in some cases were with top quality castmates. And she knew, though, that the casting decision for her to play a Native American or a South American or any ethnicity had first to do with skin color and then talent. And then, of course, we've all watched the movies where the decision to cast a white person as a person of color was just, it was accepted. It was okay. So she kind of had to deal with not a double standard. She was sort of typecast. Her Oscar, which was for the Best Supporting Actress in a Film, she earned for her incredible role as Anita in West Side Story. Have you seen Anita in West Side Story? Have you seen West Side Story? Like the real movie, not the high school theater production. Although the high school theater production obviously is taken off. So imagine the feeling of liberation that she must have felt, being able to sing and dance, to be cast as a Puerto Rican in a film about Puerto Ricans assimilating into American culture. Now, you can view West Side Story today, and parts of it scream at you. They scream, America, 1960, 1961. It's kind of ugly. It's a much more segregated time. And filmmaking was a much less conscious industry. To see Rita Moreno and some of the finest dance moves on film that you'll ever see, please catch 5 minutes on YouTube of her and the Jerome Robbins choreography of these dancers doing America. YouTube, Rita Moreno, America. So loyal listeners, if you think I've wandered off track on this, I haven't. In her memoir, and this is the important part, Rita writes candidly about being cast because of her color and also the roles she earned from how we'd call them today colorblind producers. There were a few roles that she had where she earned the role. She played the character who was written as a character, and that there was never a skin color or a preference or an ethnicity that was implied for the role. And she talked about being grateful for those too. So in the reboot of One Day at a Time, she plays a grandma and a kind of a Cuban diva of sorts. She's a little over the top, and it looks like she's having a ball. Throughout Moreno's career, however, she honed the sound and the shtick of her own mother's broken English, and this comes through loud and clear in this show. In the mid-70s, she crafted the character of Googie Gomez, as she calls her, and this is a direct quote from her memoir, the worst Hispanic cabaret singer of all time. Her gestures were operatic. Her eyelashes a mile long, and her makeup was applied with a trowel. Her slinky gowns suffered continued wardrobe malfunctions. Finally, though, it was Googie's mispronounced English that placed her in the Terrible Performer Hall of Fame.
It is so funny. And I play this very big character. She's a diva. She's vain. She just thinks she's God's gift. That's always fun to play.
Her name's Lydia.
Her name is Lydia.
Lydia.
Yes, and she talked like this.
Yes, I hear. So we're going to jump right into it.
I was just doing my mom. I was just doing that.
I was going to say, I heard a little Googie Gomez in Lydia.
And Googie Gomez is really based on my mom.
Which is, of course, your legendary character from Broadway.
You know, the English is an extremely difficult language. And, you know, the rules, there's so many rules, some of them made to be broken. It's just impossible. And my mom had trouble with J's and Y's. She would juxtapose. Do you know what I'm saying to you? I mean, she came up with words. Oh, my God. She embarrassed the hell out of me.
So, wow, her mom, didn't take offense to, it's that whole thing where parody or self-deprecation is allowed within the community. It's understood that that's acceptable. It's when it is then parody or deprecation cast from perhaps a more privileged person that it becomes poor form. So fast forward 40 years, and Rita Moreno has brought these comedic chops, this timing, this shtick, to Norman Lear's then 2017, the year it premiered, One Day at a Time. And in her capacity as the family matriarch, however, this is this opportunity. This is the one she's been waiting for since having to endure all those crummy roles all those years. She gets to try to work with this cast to instill ethnic pride, to discuss the life of an immigrant family, the traditions of a family, and how they roll off of her daughter and her grandkids. To some degree, some of the very same plot content that was in West Side Story. But this time, Moreno gets to play it more for laughs, and that's kind of good. This time, Moreno gets to play it for laughs, which is kind of good. Norman Lear's soapbox still features the most challenging topics of the day, and, even the ones that were part of West Side Story. Racism, maintaining tradition through segregation, or building bridges through inclusivity and diversity. And values, cultural values like trust and dignity and integrity. So again, and this is the part of the memoir that I find fascinating and I did not know about. Rita Moreno's experience, her life experience, did not just take place in entertainment, but in fact, she lived a noted life as a non-white celebrity through the second half of the 20th century. So like from 1955 or so to 2000. And this life is rich and it's complex, and she tells it. So by all accounts, here's fun fact, she was Marlon Brando's one true love. Yes, who knew? And she sat in one of the front rows of Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech on the Capitol Mall in 1963. And so she recounts this stuff. It's very cool. And one of the best parts about reading a memoir written by someone later in her life is that she's much more likely to employ candor, to name names. She's like that older relative at Thanksgiving who's just fine to reveal the details about people, and either they can do it because the person's dead or because it's just been decided that it's important information that's been withheld too long, and the truth is important, and it needs to be shared. Age. It imparts such wisdom. Because when you read as many memoirs and biographies and autobiographies as I do, and you pick up one from a famous actor, it's an old one, it's from the 60s or written in the 70s or 80s, and more likely than not, it's fluff. It's perhaps even written by a ghostwriter. And it's some cheesy, superficial account of their life, and probably even throws in some embellishment because fact-checking back in the 70s and 80s hardly existed. And then there are tell-alls, which make everybody skeptical that the person who's written the tell-all is really telling the truth. But Rita Moreno has been hard at work telling her life story, connecting with performers of color, with really creative people of color. And so she's been developing this approach to telling her life story for a decade. The book was a really natural step. In her life story, though, that there are other parts, not just Marlon Brando and the Martin Luther King thing and West Side Story and the Oscar and the EGOT, but there's sexism and racism and sexual harassment from her life in the entertainment industry. And so it's this candor that creates a wisdom and a window into another generation's experience of what behavior and culture still reigns today in that industry. And there aren't that many recounts in celebrity memoirs. I give her a lot of credit for going to that length. This was before Me Too. So, for instance, while still in her teens, she was meeting with a man to discuss signing him as her agent, and he raped her. She wrote that while staying in London in the mid-60s, she encountered noted theater critic Kenneth Tynan. And as their relationship developed, she was single at the time, she learned of his fetishes and his power moves. She became the subject of his power moves that very much echo in today's reporting of Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein's use of power. So it was an industry trait, a hazard, an industry hazard back then. And she chose to tell a bit of her story. Because Rita Moreno is a woman who has seen and experienced the highs and the lows of American celebrity. And in One Day at a Time, she's reminding us, she's connecting us to the immigrant experience and the challenges that are faced by each generation in the family. That in this tiny apartment, you have the kids, you have the mother, and then you have the grandmother. And all of them are living life through somewhat different lenses. Moreno has the confidence at this age, the voice and the wisdom to carry this ambitious, talented Latino cast into the gripping social commentary that we know Norman Lear has in store for them. So it's interesting that the One Day at a Time refashion is on Netflix and it's not on a major network, because that's where the original was. Did Lear even bother to talk to the networks, or did Netflix hear of Lear's project and jump at the chance to be home to a show with such solid DNA? Viewership has a huge impact on renewal, so while usually Advanced TV Herstory doesn't discuss and recommend series that are still producing seasons, and usually we're dusting off old DVDs, do please take One Day at a Time for a test spin. And when you do it, relish the national treasure that is Rita Moreno, and ponder the social force that is Norman Lear. And bookmark the moment you feel the talent of Justina Machado, Isabella Gomez, and Marcel Ruiz, for they may very well be at the start of important careers. They may live to be 86 and older, creating bridges between populations who need to better be able to relate to each other. This is Herstory in the making, and this is why I podcast. Before we roll the credits for this installment of Advanced TV Herstory, I want to read you a little bit from the mailbag. About a month ago, I received an email from Mr. Charles Kent, who, out of the blue, sent this. It's entitled Love, Love, Daria. I have the entire series on DVD and have watched it all at least 100 times. He says that he has really enjoyed the podcasts. He especially liked the China Beach one, Dinah Shore, the Women of MTM, and Battlestar Galactica's Laura Roslin. While listening to the episode you presented on fashion, I was surprised you passed over Marlo Thomas as that girl. Those were some amazing clothes. I think one time I read somewhere she brought many of the styles back from London, and perhaps some of the pieces by the amazing Mary Quant. Once again, thank you for this amazing podcast. It's nice to listen, especially post-2016, a program that puts women in media in a positive light, where they aren't objectified, commodified, and critiqued. Television and reading are two of my life's passions, and perhaps now I have another. Well, thank you, Charles, first of all, for taking the time out of your day to connect with us, to offer up Daria as a perfect episode content for the future. I can assure you it's on the list. I did assure you, actually, in my reply. Yeah, there's a lot of relevance to Daria right now. And yes, Marlo Thomas and the fashion and that girl and the significance of that girl ties in with the series that we're working on this year, a series of interviews conducted with Janine Farino, who wrote the book All the Single Girls. And that girl definitely played a role in how America viewed the single woman as seen on TV. So we've got some good stuff in store. This episode of Advanced TV Herstory is produced, basically, by David Brown, who mixes in the music that is performed by Jazzer called Take Me Higher, and it can be found at Free Music Archive. I mentioned a couple books, actually many books, a small library in this episode. So there are Mackenzie Phillips's 2 books, High on Arrival and Hopeful Healing. Valerie Bertinelli has written a raft of cooking books and 2 books that kind of discuss weight and body sensitivity and getting to the point of self-confidence. Valerie Bertinelli. Rita Moreno, her book is called Rita Moreno, the Memoir, and Norman Lear, Even This I Get to Experience. So some really good reading that brings you a little closer to understanding the tremendous asset, which is One Day at a Time, both in its original version and its reboot. Find us on Twitter at TV Herstory, on Facebook, Advanced TV Herstory Podcast. And if nothing else, go to our site, tvherstory.com, and perhaps share that site with someone who doesn't necessarily want to get into the technology of downloading podcasts, but rather would just be able to press play. So at tvherstory.com, there is a player there, as well as the scripts and other information about the show. You know, it's an easy way for somebody to access this kind of show as long as they've got some Wi-Fi or data to stream it through. It has been a pleasure bringing you this installment of Advanced TV Herstory, talking at length with great enthusiasm about One Day at a Time and the national treasure known as Rita Moreno. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.